Imagine waking up one morning and finding your entire country in ruins. Cities destroyed, millions of lives changed forever, and the whole world believing that your nation would never recover. But just a few decades later, that same country shocked the world. Japan became a global powerhouse, leading the world in technology, innovation, and one of the strongest economies on Earth. How did a nation that lost almost everything? To understand Japan's incredible success, we first need to go back to one of the darkest moments in human history. It was 1945. World War II was coming to an end, and Japan was on the losing side. Then, in just 3 days, everything changed forever. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastated by atomic bombs. Thousands of buildings disappeared in seconds. Millions of lives were affected, and Japan's economy collapsed. Factories stopped working. Roads and railways were destroyed. Food was scarce. Unemployment was everywhere, and millions of families had lost everything. At that moment, many experts believed Japan would never recover. How could a country with no natural resources, no money, and almost no industry ever compete with the world's biggest economies? But while the world saw a broken nation, the Japanese people saw something different. They saw a chance to rebuild. What happened next became one of the greatest economic miracles in history, and it all started with one powerful decision. Instead of looking at what they had lost, Japan focused on what they could become. After the war, Japan faced a simple choice: give up or rebuild from the ground up. The Japanese people chose the second option. Instead of spending money on war, Japan invested in something far more powerful: education, technology, and skilled workers. Schools and universities were rebuilt. Engineers were trained. New factories were opened. Every citizen had one mission: make Japan stronger than ever before. The government worked closely with businesses, helping them grow instead of competing against them. Companies like Toyota, Sony, Honda, Panasonic, and Nissan didn't become global giants overnight. They focused on one simple idea: build products with the highest quality possible. At first, many people laughed at products made in Japan. Made in Japan was once seen as cheap and low quality, but the Japanese never stopped improving. Day after day, year after year, they kept making their products better. Soon, the same label that people ignored became a symbol of quality and trust across the world. Japan's economy started growing at an unbelievable speed, but there was one secret that made this growth even more powerful. A secret business philosophy that changed manufacturing forever, and even companies like Apple, Ford, and Samsung later followed it. But rebuilding factories was only the beginning. Japan needed something much bigger, a system that could turn ordinary factories into some of the most efficient in the world. And this is where Japan discovered one of its greatest advantages: the power of continuous improvement. Japanese companies began focusing on something called Kaizen, the idea that small improvements made every single day could eventually create massive results. Instead of waiting for a perfect idea, workers were encouraged to find tiny problems and fix them immediately. A few seconds saved on a factory floor might seem meaningless, but multiply those seconds across thousands of workers, millions of products, and millions of hours. Suddenly, those tiny improvements became a huge competitive advantage. Companies also became obsessed with quality. They didn't just want to make more products, they wanted to make products people could trust. And that mindset slowly changed the world's perception of Japan. Cars, cameras, televisions, electronics, Japanese products began appearing everywhere. But Japan had another problem. It had very few natural resources of its own. So instead of relying on what was underneath the ground, Japan decided to invest in something far more valuable: its people. Education, engineering, research, and technology became the foundation of the country's future. And that investment was about to create companies that would take Japan from a devastated nation to a global economic powerhouse. But then something unexpected happened. Japanese cars started challenging the biggest automobile companies in America, and what happened next would completely change the global automobile industry. In the 1960s, something remarkable was happening. Japanese cars were entering international markets, but they weren't yet seen as the best. American manufacturers had enormous factories, powerful brands, and decades of experience. Japan was still the underdog. So Japanese companies decided they couldn't win by simply making bigger cars. They had to make better ones. Toyota began developing a completely different way of producing cars. Factories focused on reducing waste, improving quality, and producing exactly what customers needed. Every unnecessary step was questioned. Every defect mattered. Every small improvement counted. The result was something the world couldn't ignore. Japanese cars became known for reliability, efficiency, and quality. Then came the oil crisis of the 1970s. Fuel prices suddenly exploded, and consumers began looking for cars that used less gasoline. And Japan was ready. Its smaller, fuel-efficient cars suddenly became incredibly attractive to buyers around the world. Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and other Japanese brands began taking a much larger share of international markets. But cars were only the beginning. Japanese electronics companies were also making their move. Sony, Panasonic, Canon, Nintendo, and others were turning Japanese technology into products that people wanted in their homes. From televisions and cameras to game consoles and electronics, Japan was no longer simply rebuilding. It was exporting an entirely new image of itself to the world. The country that had once been associated with destruction was now becoming associated with precision, technology, and quality. And Japan's economy was growing at an astonishing pace. But every economic miracle has a price, and Japan's greatest challenge was still waiting around the corner. Because after decades of unstoppable growth, Japan was about to enter a crisis that would shake its entire economy. By the 1980s, Japan was no longer trying to catch up with the world. It was becoming one of the countries leading it. Japanese technology was entering homes across the planet. Sony televisions, cameras, electronics, and gaming products were changing the way people lived and entertained themselves. But Japan's success wasn't simply about inventing new things. It was about taking existing ideas and making them smaller, faster, cheaper, and more reliable. That philosophy turned Japanese companies into global giants. And then came one of Japan's most ambitious projects, the Shinkansen. In 1964, Japan introduced the world's first high-speed railway service. The bullet train became a symbol of something much bigger. A country that had once been devastated was now building the future. For decades, Japan kept growing. Its cities became modern, its companies became global, and its technology became part of everyday life around the world. But then, the incredible rise began to slow down, and what happened next would become one of the biggest economic lessons in modern history. Japan had reached the top, but staying there would prove much harder than getting there. For years, Japan's economy seemed unstoppable. But in the late 1980s, something began to go wrong. Property and stock prices had risen dramatically, creating an enormous financial bubble. Then, the bubble burst. Asset prices collapsed, banks struggled, businesses became cautious, and economic growth slowed. What followed became known as Japan's lost decades, a long period of weak economic growth and deflation. But here's what makes Japan's story different. The country didn't simply collapse and disappear from the global economy. Its companies continued to build products, improve technology, and compete around the world. Japan remained a major economic and technological power, even while facing serious problems at home. And those problems forced Japan to confront a difficult question: how do you keep moving forward when the growth model that made you rich no longer works? The answer would not come quickly. But Japan's story was never really about becoming rich. It was about what a country can do after losing almost everything. And that brings us to the final question: what can the rest of the world learn from Japan's extraordinary journey? Japan's story is not simply the story of a country that became rich. It is the story of a country that was destroyed by war, rebuilt itself from almost nothing, became one of the world's greatest economies, and then faced another enormous challenge when its economic bubble burst. But Japan kept moving. It invested in technology, It built globally respected companies, it improved its infrastructure, and most importantly, it continued to focus on quality, discipline, and long-term thinking. Today, Japan still faces serious challenges, but look at what it has already accomplished. A country that once lay in ruins became a global leader in automobiles, electronics, engineering, robotics, and technology. And that's what makes Japan's journey so remarkable, because becoming successful is one thing. Surviving failure, adapting to change, and continuing forward is something completely different. Japan teaches us that a country's success doesn't happen overnight. It happens through millions of small decisions, made year after year. So when you look at Japan today, don't just see a wealthy and technologically advanced country. See the journey behind it. From destruction to rebuilding, from rebuilding to becoming an economic giant, and from crisis to finding a way forward. That is the story of Japan. And perhaps the biggest lesson is simple. A country can lose almost everything and still build something extraordinary from the ruins. Japan didn't just rebuild a nation, it rebuilt its future. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves history and inspiring stories, and subscribe to Supreme Documentaries for more incredible stories from around the world. I'll see you in the next documentary.